very much. A couple of years back, Gartner came out with a report predicting what were going to be the 3 mega trends in IT for the decade. And they pointed to virtualization, cloud, and mobility. And anybody working in IT security pretty much thought, geez, I need to get a new job, because there's not much you can think of as scarier than not knowing where your endpoints are, not knowing where your data is, not knowing where your users are. So we're going to focus on the mobility side and talk about whether or not it's actually possible to have a truly secure environment for your users outside of your nice, cosseted corporate world. So guys, when Gartner looked at MDM, they said there was over 130 vendors, and they focused only on the top 23. Does that mean we're not even asking the right questions yet in mobile security?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting that in a world that's becoming increasingly deperimeterized because of mobile, the old way of securing the world are really no longer applicable. So if I'm at a Starbucks in Dublin here, I'm not talking through my corporate network. I'm using an iPad, an iPhone, and I'm talking directly to cloud-based applications. So then the fundamental issue is that what can you secure in that environment? And I think with the whole move to mobile, the focus really starts shifting to trying to secure the user. Is it really me at Starbucks in Dublin trying to access? So I think there's just a fundamental shift that the old way of doing security with mobile is really no longer applicable with the traditional antivirus firewalls.
Does that mean that you would think that mobile device management isn't really the holy grail people thought it was, and is it just going to be a feature rather than the complete solution?
Well, in fact, the notion that IT guy who's actually managing the whole infrastructure is losing control is a very, very important one. Primarily because when you're talking about heterogeneous devices, which essentially, they bring your own devices, essentially you're talking about software that is actually running on that particular machine, right, that you do not know what it is essentially doing, right? So traditional mechanisms where you enforce policies centrally to prevent that bad piece of code to not reach the endpoint, essentially is not good enough, because all sorts of a software essentially would be running at the endpoint right now, along with the fact that a legitimate exploit, which exploited the application, would also be running within the same purview, right? So the notion of multiple different fragments of software running together is a scary proposition.
Now, you mentioned the endpoints, and Tom referenced the concept of deperimeterization. Have we reached the point where the paradigm of zero trust is the only way to go, that we don't trust any part of our network, and internal or external?
Yeah, actually, you know, if you look at, Google has an initiative called BeyondCorp, and the assumption is that your internal network is just as insecure as the outside network, because there's just so many contractors, partners, people getting access to your network. And so I think people are moving to more of a zero trust, where the focus shifts on, is it really me, and layering on additional forms of authentication. And that's why all the innovation that's happening in mobile with the Touch ID, et cetera. And then, is my device actually secure? But of course, people jump from device to device, so it's really, you really need in real time the ability to validate if the device is secure. So it's the zero trust model focuses from securing the traditional network to one in which you're trusting, is it really the user, by adding layers of authentication, additional levels of authentication, and then in real time trying to see if the actual device is secure based on policy.
Exactly. I mean, the zero trust model, essentially, the paradigm is an important one, right? So it's not only the network, along with the user, like Tom mentioned, right? It's also that piece of software which is trying to access that sensitive piece of information on your phone, right? So even that essentially is a very important aspect of the whole equation. At runtime, it's very important to validate whether a piece of software has access to a piece of sensitive information, right? In the absence of that, given that there's going to be a heterogeneous piece of software bundled together, it is going to break.
We had Mike from Silent Circle on stage earlier, and he showed us their invention, which is the Black Phone. And they've taken a completely end-to-end solution where they have their own hardware platform, they have a custom Qualcomm chip with some security integrated, they've taken Android but heavily customized it, and their view is that they need to have complete control. They've even told me backstage that they have guys in the factory in China validating the components going into the phone, because that's their belief, that Is that the level of paranoia we need, or can we actually take a man off the street with any device and make it secure in an enterprise environment?
Well, I think there's two approaches. I think the first approach is the approach that you were talking about, and that vendor is doing it, but also Samsung is also integrating things from a hardware layer to validate, is it really the person's device as well. But also I think more and more people are also looking at a policy-based approach, where based on the access from the actual device, then it would enforce policy, and then force additional forms of authentication to actually validate it's the real user. And so now more and more, I think you're going to see the leveraging of Touch ID, what Samsung provides with their fingerprinting technology, will become the de facto way for authenticating in the enterprise in the coming years.
Well, I mean, owning up the whole stack is an interesting proposition, but given the heterogeneity of the application, right, a single infrastructure is not going to be all application aware, right? I mean, take for example, in the Instart logic world, right, we deliver web application. So the consumer essentially is a browser, right? I mean, the user eventually, but through a web browser, right? Browser is one central software that actually consumes a whole bunch of web apps. You do not have one browser per web app, right? So if an application is compromised, so for an endpoint to actually determine whether it is compromised or not, owning up the entire infrastructure chain is not going to help for obvious reasons, right? So the policy enforcement engine to actually suit a particular security policy on a per web app basis or per application basis is a need for R, right? Because in a device, there is going to be multiple applications that you're going to be consuming, and each one of it is different. Each one of the behavior of the application is different. Each access pattern is different. To distinguish anomaly here is going to be quite a bit of challenge.
It's interesting you reference browser exploits and security of a mobile device, because there was a very high-profile $1 million bug bounty offered by a vulnerability exchange earlier this year, where they said if anybody could compromise iOS 9, the latest version of Apple's mobile operating system, with a purely remotely exploitable browser vulnerability, they would pay $1 million to be told how to do it. On Monday of this week, they announced, guys, the deal is off the table, and everybody thought they'd run out of money, but actually they said, no, we've paid out. Somebody has come along and proven that they can remotely compromise an iOS 9 phone. So can we trust anything?
Well, the reality is that every type of operating system, every application is going to have some sort of vulnerability at some point, right? So the interesting thing is that if you actually look and break down all the data breaches that have occurred, it turns out, according to the Verizon, their latest data breach report, that over half of all the breaches had to do with compromised credentials. So, you know, just people stealing passwords, phishing passwords, getting end users to give up their passwords, and then once they get that, going in to the corporate network and then getting privileged accounts and then stealing all the information.
It sounds like you're saying the problem isn't smartphones, it's dumb users, no? Or...
Well, you know, the reality is that we still haven't fundamentally solved the password problem, and that's the majority of the breaches. So vulnerability, you know, iOS, very secure operating system, but a vulnerability is going to occur. And I think most of the damage, especially in a mobile world, can be eliminated by just educating the users as it relates to passwords, enforcing strong passwords, and then in the end trying to eliminate and kill passwords. And that's the biggest win. If you can kill passwords and leverage the mobile technology with the multi-factor authentication. I mean, no one's ever heard of you know, Apple Pay being breached yet. And look at all the millions and now billions of dollars of transactions that are occurring. So I think there are ways that you can be secure without having to be so paranoid about eventually some operating system being breached.
Yeah, I mean, it is multi-layered, right? One part of it is identifying the user, which is a very important problem, that the right user gets access to the right resources. The other aspect of it is if it's a naive user and the endpoint is indeed compromised, right? Preventing the compromised piece of code from accessing the sensitive pieces of information is also a very important part of the equation, right? Because once you have a legitimate user who essentially is compromised, but there is some bad piece of code that is trying to access the sensitive information, the data breach will still happen. Historically, the most modern-day cross-site scripting attacks in the browser realm, right, essentially has been around that. The problem essentially is, from a hacker's perspective, it is about how do I put in this piece of code onto the endpoint. Browser is possibly the only place in the whole app delivery ecosystem where content shows up unencrypted. You have encryption on the network, you have encryption at rest at the back end, but at the browser, you have it unencrypted. Any piece of vulnerable code there essentially is going to have access to unencrypted piece of information, right? So in addition to ensuring that the user is secure, the policy essentially would be to enforce who has access to important information, which essentially is about how do you essentially develop and how the whole endpoint security infrastructure evolves. Right.
Now, before we came out on stage, the guys from Kaspersky had a rather cool piece of mobile technology with 4 wheels and a large engine sitting in it. And it reminded me that Eugene Kaspersky, their CEO, is pretty infamous in IT security circles for the fact that he point-blank refuses to carry or use a smartphone. So he's of the view that, you know what, knowing what he knows, he doesn't want to be using a smartphone. Is he going too far? Do you guys take the same view? What do you have in your pocket? And how did you get influenced in your choice of device by its security stance?
Well, I don't have an old flip phone,
Okay.
but I actually have a Samsung device running Knox, and that's an example of a new level or new layer of technology that's being increasingly introduced to mobile devices, which is container technology, where you actually have a separation between work and play, and then you can put in the container your business-related applications. And so, and if you leave the organization, the IT organization can wipe the work-related stuff while you can retain your own personal information. So I think what's happening is that sandboxing virtualization is increasingly coming to mobile devices. Google's come out with Android for Work, and so that's another technology that's out there as well. So I think you can have a smartphone, but I think the key thing is to have that container, that virtualization technology to further protect the work-related assets compared to the personal assets.
So you're an Android guy. You're happy that it's got it sorted.
Yeah, I got a Note device,
Yeah.
Samsung Note device, and
Okay.
it's got a container. And if I hand my phone to my kids, they can't go into my work.
They're not
and all
going
that
to tank
stuff.
your stock or fire your staff or anything dumb. Yeah.
Exactly.
Harry,
Yeah.
what about you?
Yeah, I'm a paranoid kind of a guy, so I essentially have a manual sandbox wherein I have a separate device for my personal needs as well as my work needs. My work device essentially is configured to use a VPN, which is our corporate policy generally, right? In addition to that, the usual good habits of disallowing cookies on my phone is something that I essentially religiously follow. I also ensure that Siri, for example, on my phone is disabled on a lock screen, right? Most of the good habits which actually can extract any sensitive information out essentially is blocked, right? I mean, that's that. Yeah.
But I think the key thing is that with the mobile technology, you need at the same time a cloud-based policy engine in the enterprise to really validate and look at user behavior historically, factoring their location, what they've done as well. So you can have a relatively secure device with modern technology, with Touch ID or fingerprint technology. You can have a container, but I think you also need to complement it with a web or cloud-based solution that applies policy and says, well, wait a minute, he's never accessed Salesforce from China
more
before.
context to the decision.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
it's a combination of both having the device to be secure, but then also having the context of location, user behavior as well, that will also provide the additional layer of security. So it's, if you look at the step, reduce the number of passwords, kill the passwords, use multi-factor authentication, using modern secure technology that you can divide data, and then have, from an enterprise perspective, have policy or context aware that takes into account behavior, location, et cetera, to make the decision whether or not I really should give the user access to that application or not.
I mean, to be honest, the fact remains that the endpoint policy enforcement is still in a very, very early stage, right? We are circumventing the whole thing by ensuring that the identity of the user who's essentially accessing it is exactly the guy who should be accessing it. But most of the technology that exists out there essentially fails to secure. If your device is compromised, at that particular point of time, the user, even though he's a legitimate user, essentially is vulnerable and open to information leakage, right? So the evolution of the technology on the endpoint essentially is gonna ensure that particular part of it. Right now, most of the band-aids are to ensure that the user is a legitimate user.
Now, it sounds like you're saying that MDM is only part of the solution and part of the big picture and that context and user stuff, and much more needs to be wrapped in. So the industry has moved on. People are
Yeah.
thinking more broadly about how to solve the problem. If you were to put on your crystal ball and sort of have a look 5 years hence, what will be the end result? What will be the super secure mobile device we're all carrying 5 years from now?
Well, I think the key thing is that with the device, it will have to address multiple forms of authentication, something that you have, something you know, like a PIN, but something about you. So it will leverage not only your fingerprint, but maybe voice recognition, or the way that you hit the keys or whatever. It will recognize you, that it's really you using that device, and then factor in past behavior as well as location. All those combinations of factors beyond a PIN and a password will then result in a higher degree of security that it's really me, and it's really a secure device.
Yeah. I mean, the containerization of your devices implicitly has to happen, right? It has happened in the infrastructure space. The reason why a virtualization solution works is because you have explicit privilege hierarchies where different pieces of code have different privileges. The thing has to be carried forward into the mobile world as well to ensure that any piece of software that actually is running essentially has an associated privilege level. So its access to sensitive information is confined that way.
Okay, well, gentlemen, we're just out of time. So Tom Kemp, Harry Kolam, thank you very much for joining us at Web Summit and talking about mobile security.
Great,
Thank you.
thank you very much.
Okay.